Hello, today I want to look at the short story, The Bear Came Over the Mountain by Alice Munro. Alice Munro is probably Canada's finest writer. Now, that's my opinion, but she has an incredible collection of short fiction. She mostly writes short stories. Her short stories are published in the New Yorker literary magazine, and she's won every award possible, I'm sure. And so this is one of her stories, and her stories tend to be quite long and incredibly dense. And you'll notice a difference in this story compared to the story we did last week by Raymond Carver. Raymond Carver is very much in the modernist style of the minimalists, and so his stories are, stripped of all kind of unnecessary language and descriptions. They're very bare. They're still loaded with meaning, but it's like distilled meaning. And then we get Alice Munro, and her stories are very dense with meaning, and there's rich prose and beautiful descriptions. Her characterization is second to none. The way that she can develop characters is so incredible, and it's not because I think she cares so much about the character as much as she's interested in really giving us a sense of what life is about, and she just is incredible with exploring ideas that we all encounter in our life. This story has a third person narrator. In our story last week, Cathedral, we had a first-person narrator, right? And so that story was spoken through our narrator. This story's third-person narrator is not a character in the story. However, the third-person narration is focalized through Grant, okay? So he's telling, or the narrator is telling us the story through Grant's perspective, okay? This is called a third-person limited narrator because the narrator has access only to one person's internal, being, consciousness, and so on. So that's what we have in this story, okay? The third-person narrator. The title of this story is interesting. The Bear Came Over the Mountain is in fact a title of a children's song, right? Or maybe sometimes it's like the bear went over the mountain, but the bear came over the mountain, the bear came over the mountain, etc. to see what he would see, but all that he could see was the other side of the mountain. Now, that's kind of obvious, right? That, of course, all you're going to see is the other side of the mountain, but yet how often do we think, if only I could get to, the other side of this thing, or if only I could experience this, or look at, it's kind of that adage of the grass is always greener on the other side. And in this story, maybe that is something that we're going to learn, right? Is it that there's always something better on the other side? But in fact, it isn't. And so is this kind of a bit of a pessimistic view of life, that it's, you think it's going to be this, and then it's just more of the same. It's always more of the same, more of the same, more of the same. I don't know. You can think about that as you're reading the story. The story has very much has a lot to do with aging. What does it mean to age? What is the experience of aging? How does the aging person feel? How does it affect those around the aging person? So these are ideas that are explored throughout the story. The story also contains a number of flashbacks, okay? So a flashback is a scene that has occurred earlier in time, okay, to, the present time of the story. A flashback is something that's occurred earlier to that, so it interrupts the narrative and takes us back, okay? Alice Munro also uses flash forward, so she actually takes you ahead to other things. Now, not so much in this story, but just thought I'd throw that in there. It's a freebie. So the story opens with a flashback, and this flashback occurred 50 years earlier to the present day of the story, okay? And early on, we get a sense of who Fiona is. We get a sense of her family, and we also see a contrast between her, socioeconomic status, educational background, privilege compared to Grant, who's from a small town, uneducated, very rural. And you can see that there's going to be a little bit of tension in a relationship often when people are from, different categories, okay? She's also from an incredibly left-wing family. Her mother is described as far left, and Grant doesn't seem to have the same political leanings, although it's not quite clear what his political situation is. I don't think, anyway. I can't remember now. I read the story a few days ago, and now I'm trying to remember. So anyway, I'm not going to go into everything, but I did put together a package of notes that go into some of the main ideas that are presented in the story and pose a number of questions. Okay, and I can't help but expound on this story from my interpretation of it, and I hope that if you've read the story and you have taken something different away from it, don't let my sort of interpretation of it throw you off, because there's multiple ways to interpret it. Okay, it's so deep that we can look at it. There's a lot of ambiguity, especially when we get to the end. It's incredibly ambiguous. We can interpret that in a number of ways. Okay, so don't let my own kind of discussion here and in my notes impact how you're understanding the story, okay? Because that's really important. But, it's interesting too. There's going to be something else. So in addition to the story being primarily about the process of aging and that experience of aging and, many of the things that go along with that, like moving into a care home and being separated from, your loved ones, and, kind of just that sense of helplessness when you can't remember things and you don't know where you're at and all those kinds of things. Okay, so there's all that aging part, but there's also there's a lot to do with relationships. So the relationship between Grant and Fiona is very much at question. Okay, so this very intimate relationship between them, and you can look at their relationship in some ways as just kind of a bit of a type or of an awareness of relationships during this time period. So some of it's like to do with the time period. I think it was like kind of the 70s, and Grant is somewhat of the what is he? How does he refer to himself as? Let me just look here. The philanderer. Yeah, the philanderer. So he's like a philanderer. He's cheating on his wife all the time, justifying it, and so on. And I want you to look at his attitudes toward unfaithfulness, toward sexual harassment, I would say, and see how you kind of feel about that, and how that has impacted his relationship with Fiona. And then I kind of suggest, because the text suggests that maybe Fiona is playing a game, that maybe she's not really experiencing Alzheimer's, but she's getting back at Grant for everything he's done to her. And even you'll see her develop this rather romantic-ish relationship with a man in the home, which is kind of a whole interesting piece that I want you to look at. And in the presentation that I put together on how to write about literature, in there I've set up a bit of an essay on this story as the model. So you can also refer back to that, because it's always good to refer back to that when you're reading when you're writing essays, but also just to kind of see how, I sort of developed a thesis and then wove it throughout that entire presentation. You'll see, some middle paragraphs, some good examples of different things, okay? So just to remind you of that can offer you a bit more commentary on the story, okay? I also included a link to a YouTube video that's a trailer of a movie that was made out of this short story. It's called Away From Her, so you may be interested in looking into that. Okay, that's all I'm going to say about the story, but please read through all the notes. There's lots there. I could have written 100 pages on this story, but I kept it fairly short. Okay, take care, everyone.